one of the costs that might be at least as significant as all of those in terms of American interests is one that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, which is the ability of competitors to the United States and to its hegemonic power being able to exploit long-standing resentments toward the United States by trying to put this war into the context of that narrative that the United States uses its military force and wars to go around the world trying to control other countries and destroy other countries for its own benefit. There are a lot of lingering resentments from all kinds of developing countries that are very important and powerful economically, becoming more so every day, who previously could never do anything about it because the United States, after the fall of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, really was the most powerful country by far on earth, one of the world's great hegemons. And there was no alternative, there was no competitive framework, and countries couldn't do anything other than simmer in their own anger and resentment. But the emergence of BRICS, this 20-year-old or so alliance between countries that have grown enormously, particularly China, but also India. The other three countries are Brazil, Russia, and South Africa, are now really providing a genuine alternative to the United States, and this war in Ukraine is driving a lot of countries, valuable and important geostrategic countries, into the arms of BRICS and away from the United States. Here, for example, from the German newspaper Deutsche Welt is on April 10th of 2023. The headline is "A New World Order. BRICS nations offer an alternative to the West." And this article basically just walks through the foundational history of BRICS and how it is becoming ever more powerful. Quote, "The acronym began as a somewhat optimistic term to describe what were the world's fastest growing economies at the time. But now the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are setting themselves up as an alternative to existing international financial and political forums." Quote, "The founding myth of the emerging economies has faded," confirms Gunter Mallard, deputy director of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, or SWP. Quote, "The BRICS countries are experiencing their geopolitical moment. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are trying to position themselves as representatives of the global South, providing, quote, an alternative model to the G7. The G7 is an informal forum of heads of state of the world's most advanced economies, founded in 1975. Germany, France, the UK, Italy, Japan, Canada, and the US are members, as is the EU. In 2014, with $50 billion, around 46 billion euros in seed money, the BRICS nations launched the New Development Bank as an alternative to the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. In addition, they created a liquidity mechanism called the Contingent Reserve Arrangement to support members struggling with payments. These offers were not only attractive to the BRICS nations themselves, but also to many other developing and emerging economies that had painful experiences with the IMF structural adjustment programs and austerity measures. This is why many countries said they might be interested in joining the BRICS group. Since the start of the Russian war in Ukraine, the BRICS countries have only distanced themselves further from the so-called West. Neither India, Brazil, South Africa, or China are taking part in sanctions against Russia. This has become increasingly clear with near historic levels of trade between India and Russia, or in Brazil's dependence on Russian fertilizer. Quote, "Diplomatically, the war in Ukraine appears to have drawn a stark dividing line between Eastern-backed Russia and the West," political scientist Matthew Bishop from the University of Sheffield wrote for the Economics Observatory late last year. Quote, "Consequently, some European and U.S. policymakers worry that the BRICS may become less an economic club of rising powers seeking to influence growth and development and more a political one defined by their authoritarian nationalism." Now, obviously, Western academics and Western journalists are going to malign and disparage anything that becomes a competitor to the United States. The reality, however, is that three of those countries of the five, Brazil, India, and South Africa, clearly are democracies by every sense of the term. And in fact, although there may be some authoritarianism in all of those countries, there certainly is. There's a lot of authoritarianism in the West as well. And what makes this really important, this alliance, is that this is where population growth is taking place. While demographics and population growth slow in the West for all kinds of reasons, including growing secularism and the emergence of women in the workforce who are postponing having children or turning away from the marriage framework that produces a lot of children. Economic growth is very significant in most of these developing countries, and these countries, especially these 5 kind of core anchor members of the alliance, are talking about major countries, including the 2 largest countries in the world, China and India. Brazil is the 6th largest country in the world, and they're looking to expand into many highly populated and geostrategically crucial countries, including potentially Saudi Arabia, one of the anchors of American power in the Middle East. And of course, this year, while the US was single-mindedly fixated on Ukraine for whatever reason, Ukraine, a country that nobody ever considered to be of much importance geopolitically. In fact, President Obama often said, when asked why he didn't confront Russia more over Ukraine, that Ukraine is not of a vital interest to the United States. That has been the view of Washington for decades, because of course it's not. But while Washington is monomaniacally obsessed with Ukraine, sending huge amounts of American tax dollars to fuel that war, China waltzed into the Middle East and forged a peace agreement between the 2 most important countries in that region, Iran and Saudi Arabia, right under the United States' nose, something that would have been inconceivable, unthinkable, as recently as 5 years ago. But that is one of the costs, the many costs, of the very bipartisan obsession with keeping this war in Ukraine going. Here's another article, one from Reuters in June of 2023, that describes the growth of BRICS. Quote, more than 40 nations are interested in joining BRICS, South Africa says. Quote, more than 40 countries have expressed interest in joining the BRICS groups of nations, South Africa's top diplomat in charge of relations with the bloc said on Thursday. The question of how far and fast to expand the club is top of the agenda of the Summit of Nations seeking to offset perceived hegemony of the U.S. This is Reuters, so of course they have to say perceived hegemony of the U.S. Perceived hegemony of U.S.-led West in global affairs. Aside from the 22 countries that had formally asked to join, Sukal said there was, quote, an equal number of countries that have informally expressed interest in becoming BRICS members, including all the major global South countries. South African officials want BRICS to become a champion of the developing world, and Argentina, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Cuba, Democratic Republic of Congo, Gabon, and Kazakhstan have all expressed interest. That represents a gigantic portion of the world's population. And as usual, the media narrative at the start of the war in Ukraine was that, quote, the entire international community is on the side of the United States and against Russia. And what the international community means is the United States and Canada, its Western European allies, and whatever countries happen to be bribed or coerced or just falling on the side of the United States at any given moment. That's the international community. And everyone else is talked about as, quote, the rest of the world. So you have the international community over here, that's the United States, and everybody subservient to it at any given moment. And then you have the rest of the world. The problem is that the rest of the world is becoming bigger and stronger and more powerful and more united, largely as a result of the war in Ukraine. Now, one of the things that I found most interesting, most revealing, is that it wasn't people like me and critics of U.S. foreign policy who have been pointing this out only. Very recently, in fact, in May of 2023, just 2 or 3 months ago, Fiona Hill, who is a highly beloved insider in Washington, she was in the Trump administration for a little bit of time, but she's a fanatical hawk on both Russia and China. She's the kind of person who cheers every American war. She's half American, half British. She is a disciple of John Bolton. That was one of her primary allies inside the Trump administration. I say all that just to indicate that she is the opposite of a radical critic of U.S. foreign policy and the foreign policy community or national security state. She is representative of it. And yet she delivered this lecture called the Leonard Marie Lecture that gathers all foreign policy elites in Western European capitals in the United States. And it's supposed to be a gathering of all the great policy minds in the West. And she used the opportunity of this speech to warn the West that although they claim to their populations that the war in Ukraine is so noble and benevolent, and they had their media try and convince its citizenry that the entire international community was united on the side of the United States and the West, the reality is starkly different. Instead, she said, the war in Ukraine and the United States and NATO's very aggressive involvement in it, attempt to fuel it, obvious desire to prevent any diplomatic resolution, is fostering and nurturing and fueling the long-standing resentments that Russia, China, and the rest of these countries that are trying to create an independent pole of power exploit to convince countries that they are better off following BRICS, which essentially means falling into the sphere of China. So let's listen to a portion of what Fiona Hill said. I actually think this is one of the most important speeches of this year, not so much because of what she said, that's something I would say and a lot of other people would say for a long time, but principally because of who it came from and the audience to whom she delivered it. Let's take a look at that speech.
Now, since 1991, the United States has seemingly stood alone as the global superpower, but I would argue that today, after a fraught two-decade period shaped by American-led military interventions and direct engagement in regional wars, the Ukraine war highlights the decline of the United States itself. Now, this decline is relative, of course, economically and militarily, but it is very serious in terms of US moral authority. And again, we've heard quite a lot about that as well. Unfortunately, just as Osama bin Laden intended, the US's own reactions and actions have eroded its position since the devastating terrorist attacks of 9/11. America fatigue, and we actually heard about that,
is part of Osama bin Laden's vision after 9/11. Regardless of how you think 9/11 happened, Osama bin Laden in interviews saw the very exciting potential to him that by overreacting or using 9/11 as an excuse to start a bunch of new wars and bomb a bunch of countries and engineer regime change and a bunch of others, that just as Fiona Hill just said the United States is doing in Ukraine, that the United States through its own actions would essentially be digging its own grave, that it would be fueling the resentment and reaction against the United States. And over the next 15 years, so many things obviously happened in terms of what the United States did when it came to avenging 9/11, or at least in the name of avenging 9/11. But if you look, and I reported on so many of these cases, at every person who was arrested who was a Muslim or who had allegiance to Al-Qaeda or ISIS, who either carried out a terrorist attack on Western soil or who got caught attempting to carry out an attack on Western soil, they all said the same thing, which is that prior to 9/11, they didn't particularly have a lot of hostility toward the United States, but that as a result of what the U.S. did after 9/11, going around the world, killing a bunch of innocent people, drone bombing children under President Obama, and wiping out families the way President Biden did on his way out of Afghanistan, that it just drove them, it caused them to feel all sorts of rage over watching the United States go to these other countries, predominantly Muslim countries, and kill huge numbers of people. And I remember in particular reporting on the case where the person accused of being the Times Square bomber, somebody who was going to try and detonate a bomb in Times Square, the judge who was presiding over his sentencing looked at him with disgust and shock and said, I understand that you have what you regard as righteous anger about what the United States has done, but you weren't going to kill American leaders. You were going to kill innocent people, children. How can you possibly justify doing that? And he looked at her and he said, why don't you ask American leaders that when they send their drones that kill Muslim children and kill innocent people throughout the Muslim world the way you've been doing for decades now? The CIA has a term for that. It's called blowback. That when a country appears to be bullying the world through its superior economic military force, killing all kinds of innocent people, then that is going to produce huge amounts of anti-American sentiment. And that's exactly what happened in the wake of 9/11, and that's what's happening now in the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.